regardless of the fact that the historical and contemporaneous biological evidence favors creationism over evolution. The scientific evidence for age of the universe similarly favors evolution over creationism. That is, whereas creationism says we have been on this earth for roughly about 6,000 years, scientific dating nomenclature, which says the earth is millions of years old, seems to favor evolution. In the next couple of slides, I explore the controversy over the scientific dating evidence using primarily scientific methods and statements from the Bible that relate to interpretation of the scientific evidence. Come along with me on this exciting exploratory adventure. Next slide. The element carbon is an essential component of all biological life. In organic chemistry, every possible combination of different elements requires carbon for its formation. Other elements can be joined to carbon, with carbon as the starting element. The alternative not feasible at all. A naturally occurring isotope or permutation of carbon known as carbon-14 enables implementation of carbon dating. All radioactive isotopes such as carbon-14 decay over time, with their half-lives measures of their rates of decay. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years, that is, loses half of its mass every 5,730 years. Next slide. While the carbon-14 isotope is unstable, as such characterized by decay and a half-life of 5,730 years, the carbon-12 isotope is stable, not characterized by decay. Carbon dating revolves around application of ratios of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in organic material to determination of ages of organic materials such as fossils, soil, parchments, etc. Next slide. Carbon-14 dating has had issues of reliability, particularly uncertainty as to the extent to which its half-life always has been 5,730 years. Tree rings, which are measures of ages of trees, have successfully been applied to achievement of improvements in reliability of carbon dating. Improvements in reliability of carbon dating or not, reliance on carbon dating within the scientific community is fact. As such, is deserving of attention. Next slide. Due to its half-life of 5,730 years, and the fact that it is not expected to be detectable after 60,000 years, carbon-14 dating is not expected to be reliable for dating of age of organic material assumed to be more than 60,000 years old. For organic material assumed older than 60,000 years, the dating element applied is potassium or other radioactive elements. It is important to note here that, as already discussed, carbon is more central to organic life than potassium. Next slide. Application of carbon dating by scientists to some organic material assumed to be more than 60,000 years old yielded measurable levels of carbon-14, implying the organic material really was less than 60,000 years old. In light of the scientific evidence, applicability of carbon dating must be based on test results or outcomes, as opposed to assumptions about ages of organic material. If scientists will not listen to their own evidence, why exactly should the general public? The scientific evidence always must outweigh any assumptions that precede implementation of scientific tests. Next slide. Alright then, what are the pertinent scientific claims that have been produced by carbon-14 or potassium dating? Well, first, our planet Earth is supposed to be millions of years old. Second, man-like forms such as Australopithecus, etc., man-like forms who stood upright, who never hopped around on all fours for getting around, are supposed to be about 50,000 years old. If man-like forms are about 50,000 years old, emergence of man either by intentional design, that is via creation, or by evolution must date back about 50,000 years. Next slide. The contradiction. The Bible states man-like forms have been on planet Earth for no more than about 6,000 years. We have then a contradiction between creationism and evolution as to exactly how long man-like forms have traversed the Earth. In light of the size of the contradiction, 6,000 years vis-a-vis 50,000 years, both creationism and evolution cannot be right. Only one of the two theories of origins of life must possess credibility. Next slide. For resolution of the puzzle, we are going to develop and apply a scientific principle embodied into related illustrations. Consider the vase in the picture to the left of the slide summary. Vases are made from mud, that is, are from soil baked in a kiln. Clearly, the mud utilized in creation of the vase precedes the vase, that is, existed prior to attempts at sculpturing of the vase, as such is, matter of fact, older than the vase. Based on outlined scientific reasoning or principle, the age of the vase cannot be deduced from the age of the mud incorporated into the vase. By this reasoning, if the vase is found as an artifact, absent any historical evidence, any dating of the mud produces only the age of the mud, not the age of the vase. In order to date the vase, we need evidence for when exactly the vase was sculptured. In the case of the vase in the slide, depictions of defeat of Troy of the Trojan horse fame, place creation of the vase somewhere around 340 to 330 BC. The age of the constituent mud? Who knows? The vase is too valuable a relic of history to be destroyed merely so we can date the mud from which it is made. Next slide. For clarity and avoidance of any ambiguity, let us reiterate the scientific principle developed in the preceding slide with a discussion of the cat table to the left of the slide summary. The wood from which the table is made comes from a tree, contains carbon. Since the wood had to have been cut from the tree, then had to be dried and treated prior to incorporation into the table, it is matter of fact that the wood from which the table is made is older than the table. Any attempts at dating carbon in the wood tells us the age of the tree that produced the wood, not the age of the table. For dating of the creation of the table, we need to know exactly when it was a carpenter put all of the wood together. Now, as reasonably can be the case, wood used for the top of the table can come from an older, stronger tree. Reliability of carbon dating implies two sets of dates for the wood in the table. One date for the tabletop, another for table legs. In presence and application of this scientific principle, we conclude the same biological or carbon constituting entity can generate many different ages. Next slide. What then is summary of application of the scientific process to resolution of the puzzle or contradiction? Well, whenever constituent materials exist before organisms such as man, animals, fish, etc. are formed, the age of constituents of the organisms cannot tell us timing of creation of the organism. Next slide. Using the very same principle, if light and gaseous matter that are constituents of our sun, moon, and stars precede creation of said luminaries, which is essence of the Big Bang theory, ages of light from or matter from which the sun, moon, or stars are made cannot reveal ages of the luminaries. Next slide. Using the principle we have established, we will find that the biblical account of creation has been misinterpreted by each of Christians and scientists. Next slide. Well then, what exactly does the biblical account say about creation? In Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, the Bible says the earth already existed before God commenced creation. By the account in Genesis, the soil utilized in creation of man in Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 and animals in Genesis chapter 1 verses 24 to 25 already existed before man, animals, etc. were created. Yes, the Garden of Eden was new, but the earth already existed. Man and animals were new, but the material from which they were made, the soil of the earth, already existed. Since the sun and moon and stars are made from gaseous matter already in existence, in Genesis chapter 1 verses 15 to 19, matter in these luminaries can be billions of years old, yet their age is no more than 6,000 years. Given the earth already had a physical form, that is, a prior formation date, but with the sun, moon and stars made from already existing gaseous matter, the expectation or prediction that gaseous matter precedes physical matter that is explicit in the Big Bang theory implies matter in the sun and stars are older than earth matter. The scientific evidence concurs, saying that the sun and the stars consist of matter that is older than earth matter. Next slide. Lest rendition of Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 2 in the preceding slide be considered a Christian interpretation. The interpretation is confirmed by Jewish scholars such as Rabbi Rashi, a medieval authority on the 5 books of Moses, who lived between 1040 and 1105 AD. Next slide. In light of the creation account, we conclude the earth already existed before man and animals were created. We conclude man and animals' bodies incorporate soil from the earth, soil that already existed before the 7 days of creation week. Given the earth existed prior to creation week, we cannot, by dating of organs or bones from man's body, both of which incorporate earthy soil, determine how long man has been on this earth. Further, given the soil from which the earth was made already had existed, constituents of man's body potentially can be millions of years old. Using the same argument, dating of constituent matter or light from sun, moon or stars cannot reveal timing of creation of any of said luminaries. Next slide. Having applied the scientific principle to interpretation of the biblical account, do we have any supporting or contradictory evidence from science? Using carbon dating, scientific studies cited in the accompanying slide show soil within the same geographical region can exhibit different ages. Since erosion, soil deposits, types of trees, fruits, etc. affect soil composition, different ages for soils within the same proximate region is reasonable. Now consider that the amount of carbon in human bodies cannot be independent of amounts of carbon in soils used for growing of crops and feeding of cattle. Carbon dating of organisms living off different ages of soils then can produce different results. As is evident from studies cited, while the comparison relates mostly to substitution of fish in diets, science already has produced evidence consistent with the assertion that carbon composition of food we eat affects amounts of carbon in our bodies. Using the outlined scientific principle, we conclude both the Bible and science agree timing of creation cannot be deduced from age of component materials incorporated into creation, it becomes impossible then for carbon dating to reveal timing of arrival of man-like forms on Earth. Carbon dating only can tell us ages of constituent materials of bodies that have man-like forms. Next slide. So far, using the matter-of-fact scientific principle, we arrive at the conclusion that while carbon dating provides us with estimates of ages of carbon in organisms, such as man or animals, it is unable to tell us exactly how long ago organisms lived on planet Earth. While this conclusion is matter-of-fact, unambiguous, and normatively true, it leaves unanswered the question as to how long exactly it is man-like forms have been on Earth. We still are left with a vacuum as to how exactly to choose between creationism and evolution insofar as credibility of the two candidate paradigms as theories for origins of life are concerned. Next slide. While history of life on Earth only is one source of evidence, history derived from archaeological sources, history that itself is to one degree or the other validated using carbon dating, is credible evidence for how far back we are able to trace presence of man-like forms on planet Earth. Based on the historical archaeology-backed evidence, we do not have any historical records penned by man-like forms that are more than about 6,000 years old. Does this demonstrate impossibility of man-like forms that are about 50,000 years old? Definitely not. The length of time of 6,000 years does, however, tally very nicely with biblical records which say man-like forms have been on planet Earth for roughly 6,000 years. More importantly, in light of three prongs of evidence, namely, first, evidence in Exodus chapter 17 verse 14 and 2 Samuel 8 verse 16 that the God of the Bible writes. Second, evidence in Genesis that the God of the Bible made man in his own image, that is, made man such that he or she is capable of writing. And third, archaeological evidence that only man-like forms that have been on this planet for about 6,000 years have any written historical records. We conclude that the record in the Bible is consistent with historical facts and backed by credible evidence. Historical evidence that the Hebrew race emerged not too long after the oldest civilizations, the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, and continued existence of the Hebrew race lends credence to historicity of the biblical account of creation. Do we then outrightly rule out evolutionary theory? Necessarily not. At the present time, however, all of the credible evidence points to creationism, not evolutionary theory. There does not exist any iota of credible evidence for evolutionary theory. The clincher on the two paradigms, history backed by archaeology, has arrived at the consensus that all of man-like forms, black, Nubian, red, yellow, pale, bronze, brown, white, ruby red, etc., descended from a literal as opposed to a figurative single couple. Next slide. What then about carbon dating, which dates carbon matter to be as old as 50,000 years in man-like forces? Well, there exist several potential explanations. First, as already matter-of-fact established, age of carbon in man-like forms does not tell us exactly when those man-like forms lived. Those forces could, consistent with biblical records, be less than 6,000 years old. Second, some forces previously deemed to be man's evolutionary ancestors have been shown to be merely men less than 6,000 years old, characterized by some spinal deformation. Such mistakes and their subsequent correction are matter of fact true within the scientific community. Third, if there really have been man-like forms who lived on this earth about 50,000 years back, given they could not write, And given the God of the Bible made man such that he could write, their history is not incorporated into the Bible. Given those men have a different creator, they cannot be ancestors of man who writes, cannot be ancestors of man made in the image of the God of the Bible, man whose writing records have been exhumed by archaeologists. We conclude then that if indeed there were man-like forms on earth about 50,000 years ago, they are not ancestors of man whose history is only about 6,000 years. If they are not ancestors, there does not exist any evidence for an evolutionary connection. Next slide. Here now, we find ourselves close to the end of our adventure. What then are we to conclude from all of the evidence? Well, while we cannot rule out possibility of evidence in future, which may support existence in past of man-like forms that are about 50,000 years old, we know for a fact only evidence for man-like forms that are about 6,000 years old is credible. In all of those matter-of-fact 6,000 years, there does not exist a shred of evidence for evolutionary theory. Consider this carefully, my friends. In all of documented history within all ancient civilizations, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, etc., there is not a shred of evidence for evolutionary theory. In aggregate, we conclude the matter-of-fact evidence provides support for creationism only. We do not find any matter-of-fact support for evolutionary theory. We conclude then that relative to evolutionary theory, creationism requires the smaller leap of faith as credible theory for origins of life on earth. Next slide.